Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to Dice and Mind, a monthly podcast in which we explore the meaning of life through the lens of RPGs.
We're lifelong friends, a couple of guys in their 40s who along the way had families and became professionals. Over the years, we've talked about pretty much everything. But recently, we realized we both had an interest and some history with tabletop role-playing games. So,
In each episode, we will consider everyday stuff like science, religion, philosophy, and economics, all through the lens of a specific role-playing game and its dice mechanic. For example, what would I have to roll in the Edge of the Empire narrative dice system to get that promotion at work?
or would getting that paper published give me advantage on a subsequent D20 roll in Dungeons & Dragons?
If I were DM, likely not. But join us now and every month to think deeply, geek out, and explore how RPGs make the world just a little bit better.
This is
Dice in Mind.
So in the last episode, we started geeking out on Star Trek, and we don't need to rehash that all here. If you didn't listen to the last episode, you can listen to this one, but I would recommend going back to that one because we did a lot of intro as to what we're going to be talking about here. The focus for the next episode or two is going to continue to be Star Trek. We're looking at Star Trek as a 3-episode arc in our podcast series. Today, we're actually going to get into the Star Trek Adventures role-playing game and the 2D20 system. So I have been reading this for a while. We talked about that in the last episode, my unhealthy addiction to the Star Trek books. But Jason and I both we both have been looking at the starter kit because it's very concise and it helps us back off from a lot of the details, and it allows us to use this as a means for us to talk about the mechanic and how it relates to everything we've been talking about with prior RPGs. So, Jace, I've been reading this stuff for a while, so I'll yield the table. But as you've been reading through this material more deeply now, because of us doing these episodes, what's your take on the mechanic versus, let's just say, the other D20 systems? Let's not get into the narrative systems yet.
Yeah, and hello, everybody. Good to have you back. Brad, it's a good question. So this is something that Brad and I have, as you can imagine, been talking about fairly regularly offline in bits and pieces for a while. A number of things jump out to me, positive as well as negative, about the Star Trek Adventures dice mechanic. But we've agreed, let's start with the things that are really just cool, the things we like, the things that make sense. For me, as I've been learning about the mechanic, really diving into it, as you said, one thing that really strikes me is the 2D20 dice mechanic. Now, as you already know, it's not the fact of the 2D20 that I like. In fact, I think to me, the 2D20, honestly, Brad, is a little bit of what I would call a Spaceballs move, right? 2D20, the quest for more money. I think it's a way that Jay Little, its brilliant creator, could come up with to make this different than other games. Good on him. But what really does get me intrigued about the 2D20 system in Star Trek Adventures is what those 2D20 represent. And I'll say a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you, my friend. For those of you listening who don't know, in Star Trek Adventures, one D20 represents what are called attributes, and the other D20 represents what are called disciplines. Now, on the face of it, this isn't overly remarkable, right? The vast majority, in fact, of RPGs use a dice mechanic of any size, shape, or form that's based on some fundamental innate abilities like brawn or intellect or charisma. We know the drill. And then they use perhaps other either dice or other modifiers to represent skills. So, if my character is really high in acrobatics, that pairs well with the D20 roll. What really, really catches me, though, about Star Trek Adventures and its dice mechanic is that the attributes and the disciplines are really much more thoughtful. The attributes are still the innate or at least things from early childhood factors. So just to hear how these sound, some of this will sound familiar, some of it might sound misplaced to some of you, dear listeners. Attributes in Star Trek Adventures: control, daring, fitness, insight, presence, reason, right? These are obviously homologs for the attributes or abilities in most other RPGs. Okay, kind of with the Star Trek-y flavor, that's as it should be. But where it really gets interesting to me is the disciplines: command, con, security, engineering, science, medicine. Okay, not shocking. These are the major professional disciplines that you would pursue, one or more, if you were serving aboard a Federation starship. Two things really, really get me on this. I think it's just so clever, so neat. One thing is that these are so finely tuned to Star Trek and ship roles. And in other words, maybe I can say this more generically as well as eloquently, I hope, these are professions. These aren't just skills like, well, I learned it on the job, but these disciplines, on the one hand, they fundamentally presume that this is an individual, this is a PC as well as an NPC, who has been rigorously educated and trained in one of these disciplines, right? You can be a scientist in Star Trek Adventures. I mean, that's even cooler than being a scientist in real life. The other thing, on the other hand, that really gets me about this is that instead of the disciplines being secondary, like you roll a d20 for attributes, i.e., abilities, and then you have some mod for your disciplines, i.e., skills, they're not. It's 2d20. It's this notion that implicit in the worldview, the world building of Star Trek and Star Trek Adventures, implicit in the understanding is that your education, your training, whom you become, what roads you followed, not merely what you were born with, your attributes are on equal footing. How incredibly realistic, Brad, is that? This notion that the two of the biggest elements, at least, in our human personal development can be represented. So I'll stop there for the moment. To me, that's what really stands out about this game.
Yeah, and when I look at if I were going to game master a game, I mean, obviously a task that needs to be done, in effect, the game master chooses attributes and disciplines that are needed. You could actually buy, in effect, I'm air quoting here, buy additional dice for momentum. But what catches me about this is that, to your point, one of the first things, and I would recommend folks, if you have any interest in Star Trek, at a minimum, just get the starter set in PDF form so you can read. It's very concise. The material in the just the book itself is worth it just to see how this game works. But we go to, and this is not a knock, you go to any of the other fantasy systems like 5e or even earlier versions, and like you said, strength, charisma, constitution. This plays to with the new series not so much, but up until the new series, kind of the idealistic world that we live in, where like you said, the attributes aren't brute force type of items. They are more Trekish in terms, presence and reason. You could play a droid with high reason, for example, like a Data, or even the discipline. See, this is, and as you were talking about it, I'm probably oversimplifying. It reminds me of Generations, when the Enterprise D is destroyed. And we've seen this in you see this all the time. When someone goes down, I remember when someone went down in Generations, Deanna Troi stepped into the con position. And so you have these disciplines, command, con, security, and all that even allow this Trekish type of function where someone can, in effect, maneuver into an area. Maybe maneuver is not the right word, but it plays to almost, this is really a bad way of putting it, you can correct me, it plays almost into what you would see if you were watching an episode of Trek. The idea of, setting a difficulty level for the task when the game master is going, instead of, Jason and I actually did play 5e in the past week for the first time we looked since December. Had to get my feet under me again, but talking about setting difficulty levels, to roll against. Here you have the same thing. But the other thing that I found was interesting, Jason, just because you and I have been talking about psionics in 5e, now you have focus areas in Star Trek. And so when I was reading this, I looked at this and I'm like, okay, astrophysics, cybernetics, infectious diseases. You could even have focus areas. It's a very kind of open-ended, and it even says in the guide, it says our specialized subjects, and these can be any topic. So ultimately, I think it's important to realize that the game, and sorry, Jason just corrected me here, so I need to be careful. You're not going to be able to hear me if I keep flipping through the book, but the book is just so cool.
They can't hear me laughing behind my mic.
Yeah, I'm so excited here as we're talking about it. And I'm flipping through my book, and all of a sudden I didn't realize when Jason goes back to edit later, he'll be able to tell me whether my words were drowned out by me flipping the pages. No. So now I've had to move the book away. But the point is that
throw down that book.
It's an open, in terms of your character development. It reminds me of how the systems have morphed, the fantasy systems have morphed over the years. This, or even Fate, for example, it's still, they give you guidelines, but it's still, for me, it feels open-ended. I don't know what your thought is on that.
It's interesting you mentioned Fate, because I don't think we've actually talked about this regarding Star Trek Adventures. I had a similar impression. So you had mentioned the foci, or focuses as they call it in here. And the first thing I thought of when I read that part of the rules was, man, this is really, no pun intended, seemingly a page out of Fate. And I mean, I guess it kind of begs the question of, eventually you and I are probably going to, maybe sooner than later, get around to Fate. But, well, I guess we all get around to Fate, don't we? Okay, sorry. But where was I going with that? Because that was funny. Maybe not. I think, with the Fate system, whatever flavor of Fate you prefer, I think that the strength is not just its simplicity, but how just remarkably narrative and outright thematic it is, even down to the character level. And I think you're right, Brad. The focus is really reminiscent. And I'll be honest, uncomfortable is the wrong term, but the notion of the focus makes me a little uncomfortable, in the sense of, whereas if you use the Genesis dice system or variants of it, like in Star Trek Edge of the Empire or its other versions, it's very, very narrative, and there's a lot of narrative wiggle room for the GM as well as the players, but the dice set the parameters around that possibility space. Whereas with the focus, like you said, it's very much I'm sorry, I'm distracted because for the first ever time, my wife just poked her head in to hear a piece of what she will never listen to. Anyways, I think the focus is kind of a tricky thing, but also a really cool thing.
I was gonna mention, just because we were talking about Fate and you mentioned the narrative system, And one thing that, as I read through this from the starter rules as opposed to the core rule book, is the simplicity where they talk about traits, advantages, and complications. And to me, when I first read that, I instinctively wanted to go grab my my narrative system, whether it was a Genesis or one of the FFG Star Wars series books, because to me, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I want to talk about that when we get to some of the challenges, because that alone almost makes it feel like the dynamic of the dice seems to almost limit the capabilities in some way. But let's come back to it. I think the idea of this, and I think, I keep saying I think, and I need to stop doing that. The system, Star Trek itself, the way it's designed, and Jason, you and I talked about this. It's a little more in terms of your abilities as a character for you to define who your character is, whether it be on a starship, whether it be on the ground on an away mission, whatever the case may be. It's more robust than I originally intended. I originally thought it was going to be. I had a preconceived notion about it. That being said, it comes to the mechanic, and how we place in real life. I think you alluded to, or you maybe even just directly mentioned it. I was too busy flipping through the book and making noise, but it is more the character generation and how we do it. This system, minus the dice mechanic, let's just talk about the character creation and the rules, feel to me more lifelike, more everyday, in terms of how you would play a character than any other system I've seen thus far. And let's bear in mind, this is also sci-fi. So you could compare it to, whatever you would maybe doing in Genesis. You could compare it to the old Firefly games. I could read them off, Starfinder, whatever the case may be. It feels much more real life compatible.
If I might jump in for just a sec, I don't know if I've articulated that for myself so well before, but man, do I think you're right? Because that's the beauty of Star Trek in part, isn't it? That whereas Star Wars and Firefly and all these things, they're so wonderfully fictional. We love them. But Star Trek has always felt to me like a plausible future, one in which you can imagine yourself. And I think you're 100% right that with this game, they design it in a way that lets you feel that way too.
Why don't I ask, because I have my opinion on it, but it's one of the first things we talked about with Star Trek, and it was one of the first things you brought up. So this idea of character generation and playing a character that you could relate to in real life and in the future existence that actually could potentially be plausible. I was watching Thor last night, and they were talking about this is science fiction, which could become science fact. And I can't remember the exact phrase. I wish I had it. But in other words, science fiction could someday, look at Asimov, could become fact, futurists and so on. The dice mechanic on here, the 2D20 system, it would almost feel like Star Trek would work really well with a true narrative system like from FFG. But let me before I jump in that far, what was your initial thoughts about this? Because you played a lot. You're the one that kind of introduced me to the narrative system, and you actually had to explain it to me a couple times before I could understand it. So you have a really good handle on that narrative system. How do you feel it compares, or in general, how do you feel the 2D20 system accomplishes what you would hope it to accomplish within the game?
Boy, it's a good question. It's a difficult question. I do feel pretty competent with FFG's narrative dice system at this point. I'm looking at my bookshelf again. I certainly have a sufficient number of books now. For most people, it's probably not that big of a collection, but it's more than enough for me. And as source material between that and I've been GMing again for my brother's kids, for my two of them, for my nephews, almost weekly for a while now, which has been a lot of fun. And that's allowed me to get some really good practice. And so um you've said many times on this podcast, Brad, that we are data guys. Um, and I stand by that with you. At the same time, I once I started reading about the narrative system, before I actually got my hands on the dice or the game, once I started reading about it, I started thinking, man, it's so interesting, and I fell in love with it. It's still my favorite system. When I then compare that to the 2D20 in Star Trek Adventures, um, they're so dissimilar in terms of mechanic, and yet I think they still have a really similar jibe. So okay, Brad, maybe this is a bit of a cop out, but here's why I say that. The writing in the examples in the material is so good. You had said a while ago in this episode that it really feels to you like this game brings the player and the GM into into like an episode of Star Trek, right? I agree with you. And then like I look through my starter rules, and I read, because it's replete with examples of text, of flavor text, and sometimes of narrative text to move the story along. And I think, Brad, if like you think of all of the books between the two of us we have for Edge of the Empire, for 5e, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, there's neat flavor text, but then you get into the Star Trek flavor text, and you can tell. I mean, I'm making an assumption here, but I stand by it. You can tell that it was written by really legit writers. It's just so well done. It's so engaging. And so I think, if this makes sense, listeners, in that sense, on the one hand, the narrative dice system uses the mechanic to create space and guide the storytelling, like you're there part, hopefully, of playing. On the other hand, Star Trek Adventures uses, I guess, really uses the world building to fill that. And then because of the discipline and what is it, attributes dice, the 2d20 dice, it allows you to navigate your character within that space. I don't know if that's really what you're asking, Brad, but for me, that's how I see something very different, still bringing us to a very similar point in play. Regardless, Brad, you have some really interesting ideas about some of the more complex mechanics in the system. Why don't you go ahead and talk about those?
Yeah, so as you and I've read through this, and obviously, we are, we have done some comparisons between the narrative system, the FFG Star Wars / Genesis system, and the Star Trek system, and their relationship with writers and so on. It When you look at it, it again, this feels very. Let's remove the dice mechanic. I know we that's the goal of this, but let's, for the sake of discussion for a moment, remove the dice mechanic. When you start looking at how this all plays out, traits, and obviously the different characters, the character disciplines and attributes, what's interesting to me is you have these advantages and complications. So it seems to be that it is almost shoehorning in non-dice components that would traditionally be part of the dice mechanic in the Star Wars Genesis world. So when I think about this, and you and I have kind of talked about this, it reminds me a lot, or I just get this vibe that in using the system as a potential game master, I could almost, in theory, drop the whole dice mechanic and make it a completely narrative system, with player characters like yourself making decisions and choices, and then in effect using like a permanent game master prerogative to narrate the story. Obviously now you have to have a game master that wants to continue to play versus the one who has their own goals of murdering you or making life, making the game unplayable, or just a situation where it wasn't fun. But the dice to me in this environment seems almost secondary. Like they've built this really nice system with the attributes and the traits, and then when you get into advantages and complications, it kind of you could probably explain this even better to me. There's like a dice component there that was in Genesis Star Wars that isn't here. But what I have found, that aside, and I want you to come back to this, but what I have found is that this game, independent of the dice mechanic, feels again to be the most realistic and almost real life-ish. And what I mean by that is, we're not playing, we are playing sci-fi, but we're not playing, what do you call it? We're not playing FFG. We're not playing the old Firefly games. We're not playing Starfinder. We're not even playing D&D in the fantasy world. We are actually playing, in effect, much like we all who are Trekkie fans have hoped is kind of the future of humanity. And we're playing that out, whereas more than likely Star Wars and the Force are not the future of humanity. So, but, what I'll ask you is, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I really feel like the dice can offer some use in the game, but the game could be just as fun without even using any dice. And that's just a thought that's popped up.
I think that's so interesting as an observation. I mean, obviously, I agree with you in terms of Star Trek being future history. We talked about that already a little bit earlier in the episode, that certainly I think to our minds and to many, many others, Star Trek is so much more believable. Like you said, I would personally like to think that there are maybe Jedis in our future, although perhaps ones with better judgment. But that's not the same thing as looking at Star Trek as a way to go. And boy, I don't know if I have a really well articulated response. I think on the surface, I agree with you. I think you're right that I don't want to keep coming back to the term narrative. I'm just not sure what to call it. I think the story, both implicit as well as constructed in a game, in Star Trek, just has this innate potential to be all that much more realistic, all that much more ersatz real life. And like you said, Brad, part of that is not just because that's Star Trek, perhaps, but because that's how they've written the material for this game. I think you had said really early on in the episode, and we even talked a little bit maybe about this last episode, that the game is like you are in Star Trek episodes, like you're in the Star Trek world, and it's constructed in a way where that dice mechanic can aid in that. Again, I personally find some things wonky about the 2D20 specifically in Star Trek Adventures, but I'm just really still hung up in the most positive sense on your observation that even without the dice, this would be a fascinating story in which to play. Yeah.
And I think, yeah, exactly right. I think it's interesting you brought up the episode thing, because I think we mentioned this before, but throughout the book, I mean, throughout the starter guide, itself. It talks about episode. Now you can call it. You'll hear people talk about episodes of podcasts, like our podcast, or episodes of broadcast recordings of games out on Twitch or whatever the case is. But when I see the term episode in the context of the Star Trek material, the starter kit, as an example, because we both have that and are kind of using that as a kind of a point of reference. And hopefully, when I switch the pages this time, I'm muted so you don't hear that, like you heard that earlier. But it truly reads through. When I look at some of the pre-done, there's a lot of stuff that Modifius has put out there that are free adventures that you can do. They're very good at that. It feels very episodic. Now, when you and I play D&D, I'm building it in an episodic way. You and I actually have episode numbers and somewhat silly names for each episode. This truly is built in inherent. And now, don't get me wrong, as much as I may come across like I am criticizing or tearing down the dice mechanic here, my point is that it just doesn't seem, you used the term wonky, I agree, it just doesn't seem as refined. It almost feels like they wanted to go down the Genesis path, but obviously there are some limitations. It's different companies, licensing and so on. So, they added it in. It is usable. I think, let's be honest. I mean, once we get to a point where we've played through a lot of the game that we have going, I think Star Trek would be something to investigate further and actually do some playing on it. But not to tease too far ahead, folks, but I think there's some validity of looking at Star Trek and Genesis, and I'm not talking about the torpedo from Wrath of Khan.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we'll just leave that teaser there. Brad and I keep talking about, actually, not just this past week, or maybe it was last week. You and I were chatting on the phone about how cool it would be to do that, to not create so much, to port Star Trek to the Genesis dice system. And clearly, we both want to do it. I think you put it best on the phone but not now, because I have a life at the moment, or something to that effect. Because that's consuming.
Yeah, and you and I, we're really invested. We enjoy doing this podcast. We're starting to get back into a groove after about 4 months of playing D&D again.
And it's awesome.
We've even talked about, it would be fun to try to do some Star Trek with Fate, using the Fate system, which we will probably be addressing in future episodes, because I think that's an interesting, simplistic, yet rich environment to play. And there's even older systems for those of you who are gaming veterans. There was when the way that the D&D system was licensed, which ultimately, birthed Pathfinder, there were other D20 systems like True 20 and so on. And there's different ways of looking at this, even beyond the D20 system. I think Modifius has put something together very nice. I mean, nice enough that, as we joke, I'm looking over and I'm seeing all the books that they have come out with. I pre-order them all, except I somehow missed the Delta Quadrant.
But you've rectified that.
Yes, I have rectified that. But I think ultimately this is a game that we're going to have to investigate further from a playing perspective. But like I said, we've played this idea out of how, and I guess I'll just kind of give away the tease a little bit. In future episodes, I think we're going to find a way for us to talk about and create a periodic, I'll use the term periodic, episodic insert of us working through this idea of how we would merge the Genesis system with Star Trek. Before we head over to the GM corner, Jason, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add around the game or the dice mechanic or anything.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, a question for you, because you have all of the books. Listeners, I was gonna say I'm way more cheap, but that really wouldn't be any way to label me in comparison to you, Brad, when it comes to this stuff. So I'll just say I'm cheap. And so I have my collection of RPG books, but you've been diligent. You really have been about the Star Trek books. And so I've looked at the PDFs, and of course you and I have talked here and there about the books. That said, let me ask you a question, okay, about the books in general for Star Trek
Yeah.
Adventures. Because like I had said to you when I picked up the starter kit, even though that's a box with a couple stapled volumes, even stapled, I told you I was blown away, honestly, at the quality of what was in my hands, of the print, of the Christmas. It was just, it's beautiful material. With the books, though, I think I've only seen entire at all the PDFs. You've got them there. What do you think? Um, Two kind of related questions before we go to the corner. What do you think in general of the quality of the Star Trek Adventures printed material? Just in terms of like editing, all that stuff. Feel in your hands, feel on the table, look on the table, but also because there's just a ton of uh, backstory, information, ideas, imagery, NPCs across what is it? There are the Operations Science and Command source books, and then there are now 4 quadrant books because that's how quadrants work, and then there's also the new Klingon material. Just what having gone through them like I know you have, um, just technically, what do you think of the books, and then conceptually, what do you think of the material in them?
Yeah, and that's a difficult question because you and I both, I think you have more of them than I do, but we have technical manuals that predate this game by decades. The Enterprise D, DS9, and we've talked about the actual technical components of starships and so on. So we've gotten very, very deep into that. When I look at the material itself, I think the bound material is high quality. I think it's one of the best quality bound material I have on my shelf. And I have, like you said, I have way more on my shelf than I probably should even admit to. When I read through the quadrant books, I think they're towing a line. They're towing a line to in effect, keep those of us who are Star Trek fans engaged by putting enough information in there, but also write it in a way that could potentially introduce the Star Trek universe to those who may not be as involved in Star Trek as like a you or I or others who may, you who are listening here. So I would absolutely believe. Now they come out with, not only did you say they have the 3 operations, command and science. They also have the 4 quadrant books, and then there are 2 volumes called "These Are the Voyages" and "These Are the Voyages" Volume 2, which are in effect adventure/adventures, and those are actually interesting. I find those as interesting as the other source books because by reading through them, and I wouldn't use them. I'm more of the type, and Jason's more of the type where we don't use canned, and that sounds terrible, but we don't use pre-written adventures. A lot of people do, and I don't begrudge them because they write in whatever system you're looking at. There's some really rich material. But part of the reason we do this game is to stretch our minds differently, and part of that is just by our inherent nature to try to create new and different. But those 2 books, the Voyages books, are, Jason, you had mentioned you had read through the episodic adventure and the starter guide or the starter box. Those take it to the next level. I think they absolutely are written in the context of playing them in a game. So if you're looking for like source material, then going down the technical guides and all that is the way to go in conjunction with this. You can use that material in effect to supplement and enrich the Star Trek game. And I know I'll let you wrap this up here in a second because we'll talk about being cheap after you talk about how many Starship books you have. But
I have no comment if it pleases the court.
yes, I figured. You're going to admit it because you took my shit. You took your shot at me for having an addiction to books. So we're gonna reverse that. But I have started to. I think in the last GM corner, I said I had started to look at the Klingon book. I paused that because we'll get into the GM corner here in a minute and talk about it. But I really think that the material is written in a way that'll make it easy for it to be played. There's enough there for those that want to play the game can really enrich themselves, but nothing, they aren't written as source book material. That's just now there's source information in there about starships and the different, divisions and so on. But just bear in mind the material's written in the context of the game. I don't want to set anyone up, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. So, you know, like you said, Jace, what was your thought as we wrap up? Because you read, I haven't really read through it as much as you have, but you read through the starter adventure, and I think you made some comments to me about it, and I don't want to misquote you.
Well, I'll just keep this really brief. As you know, I was really impressed. It's exactly what you said. I might hop through, like looking at adventures, but um, I I don't think I even have a single adventure book. So whether you want to call it an adventure path, an adventure source book, canned, I like reading about it, but I don't get into it. I'm sorry, one exception. Uh, I think we both have this. I know we do. I did buy Candlekeep Mysteries, or maybe it's Mysteries of Candlekeep. I don't remember at the moment. D&D, because I love the premise, and I just got it because for me it's just fodder to get me thinking about potential adventures. But that's literally the exception. The other exception is that Star Trek adventure. It's I want to say, I'm sorry guys, I don't have it in front of me, listeners. It's like Among the Stars or Across the Stars, or it's something very Trekky, but it essentially is a Federation interaction where you are stationed on an Oberth class science vessel, and you end up interacting with Romulans, and then hilarity ensues. Not really. In fact, all kinds of really problematic things happen. It's so well written, Brad. It's it's really clever in how the adventure was written to move quickly and to teach the new Star Trek Adventures GM along the way. But honestly, I wanted to know what happened next. How are they going to set this up? How are they going to what were going to be the flavor texts in the next piece of this? And it goes straight back to what you said earlier, Brad, about how this is such an immersive, uh, just wonderful environment in which to think and play. So if that is any indication of their other published adventures, I'm not saying I'm going to buy any, because again, you and I, we like to kind of do our own thing and take from what's out there. But man, I have to assume that the full-fledged, full-length adventures are pretty outstanding.
Yeah, they're a good read, even if you decide not to play them. As we move over to the GM corner, let the record show that I do not have the Candlekeep book. You have beaten me to that. So I'm just turning and looking, so hopefully you don't hear it on my mic. But I'm looking over at the shelf, and I didn't think I had it, but I wanted to confirm I do not have that one.
A little piece of
So,
my soul just died.
yep, I figured.
Yeah.
Hey, so before we get into GM Corner, I wanted to let I'm trying to pass that off. Hopefully, Angela, you're never listening to this episode.
Don't worry.
My wife. Yeah, I shouldn't worry.
Don't worry.
We have we have started to do, in effect, mini episodes, 15 to 30-minute episodes, and we're going to be bringing in people that we know, that have gamed with us or who have been gaming, who can provide insight into their experiences and how, And remember, our goal here is to talk about the mechanic and the game and how it relates to life, philosophy, economics, faith, etc. We're going to do that. I'm going to tease mine here in a second, but Jace, you're going to be premiering by the time you are all listening to this, folks. You can go back and actually see a prior episode where Jason actually interviews our friend Brian about his experiences.
Yeah. So by the time this episode drops, that bonus episode, that's how we're labeling them in the feed, that bonus episode with number one with our friend Brian will have been out hopefully for some time. We'll see. Like Brad said, we want to keep doing this. Brian is a very good friend of both of ours. Brad, you and Brian know each other initially through me since our college days. Brian and I have been good friends largely due to his poor judgment since I was in 8th grade. And well, it's a really good episode because of what he brought to the discussion. Brian and I used to play used to role play a very specific game, and I'm not going to say anything about it because that can be the teaser, not the spoiler, if you haven't already listened to it. But Brian just offered this wonderful, just this really lovely, heartfelt interview in response to our standard interview type of questions. What did you play? What did we play? What did you like about it? And importantly, what did it mean for you, especially, when you were a kid? Because Brian was, and I think arguably remains, even geekier than us. Now, wait, if you listen, you can hear the universe laughing. But I do think that's true. And Brad, you've got the next one coming up, right?
Yeah, and I'll say that I listened to the episode. I'm not going to give away anything, but even for me, having known Brian for years through Jason and Jason's brother, I still found it fascinating material, even as someone who is a partner with Jason in this podcast and who has known Brian. I've actually listened to it twice because it actually gave me insight personally to someone I know, but two, I'm always fascinated by how gaming, whatever type it is, how that affects them and what does it do and how does it affect, again, real life. And the one I'm going to do, this is going to be a little bit of an interesting one. Gentleman I know, his name is Steve Matthews. I'll actually put a link to his YouTube channels out on our Facebook and Instagram pages, so please go out and check those out. Steve's a musician. I met him and started playing with him back on the old Lucasfilm Jedi Knight 2 game when it was all just air quote saber rattling. It was literally lightsaber battles. Rudimentary, but you still had to have some technique to be able to win. He and I were in the same clan at the time. Nowadays, kids call them, back for us, it was gamer tags, but now I don't know what they call it anymore. But Steve, I found out through us playing, was a musician and a teacher. And he sent me his CDs of his band that was very popular up in the Northeast. I really enjoyed it. It's kind of an alt rock, regular rock type of thing. But I talked to Steve online about it, and he has done gaming. He's actually going to be, if I remember correctly from our chat, they're waiting. He's a teacher. They're waiting for school to complete. So by the time you hear this, it will have completed. To start up another game, another RPG game. So Steve's going to come on and talk with me for about 20 to 30 minutes. But what you'll find is interesting is if you listen to that, and that should be coming out, if not before this episode, but right at the same time. Steve and I, as much as we have interacted, we had a period of time where we, lost track of each other because we were living life. But when I interview and talk with Steve, this will be the first time he and I have ever talked voice to voice. All of our communication was either through games or through Facebook chat. And we've known each other for 20 years. And he still is a musician. He's a phenomenal musician. I think I'll probably break protocol here and we'll use some of his music as lead in, lead out for that special episode. But very long teaser for what's coming. These won't always come all the time between the episodes, but as we interact with friends and people that we know or want to we want their voice, interested in their perspective, these will pop up. And they may just pop up randomly. It depends on who are we talking to and so on. All right, I've rambled on that. Let's hit to the GM corner real quick. Jason, what has been on your desk or on your computer reading lately?
So because you and I talked about this. This isn't directly RPG related, but in my mind, it's essentially akin to the same cloth. I just read Andy Weir's third novel. If somehow, listeners, you don't know who Andy Weir is, he is the author of The Martian, which is just an exceptional read. It's so intelligent and it's so funny and it's such a good story. It's just excellent science fiction. It is so good. It's so good, in fact, that I've never seen The Martian movie because I don't want to take the chance of anything detracting from the experience of reading it. Okay, The Martian's great. His second novel, which came out, I think almost 4 years ago, or abouts, Artemis. That one takes place on the moon. Really good. Not The Martian, but really good. His third one is titled Project Hail Mary. And I don't want to ruin anything for anyone. I will limit it to this. It was outstanding. I had some time available. I read it in literally 2 days, and it is outstanding. It is even better than The Martian. I have to say, I think that this is probably now easily one of the best sci-fi novels of any kind that I've read. I mean, I loved The Martian. Project Hail Mary, for me, this is up there with my go-tos of Asimov, of the better books of Ben Bova, some very, very select few others. So just highly recommended. Again, I do think it fits, Brad, because we've been talking about how Star Trek Adventures is so just like immersive and you can see yourself in the story. And the way that Andy Weir writes, especially Project Hail Mary, it's just so evocative of imagery, and you don't see things coming. It's not at all predictable, and then the end, it's like, well, how about that? So highly recommended. What have you been dealing with in the GM corner?
Yeah, and I think I alluded to this before. In the last GM corner I had mentioned I was starting to look at the Klingon guide, and I still have that on my desk. But if I remember correctly, you had made a comment. One of your a listener or a colleague or something like that had made mention that they were an old time first edition or second edition gamer. I part of my library was built up, in all honesty, using Amazon, looking for used copies where you could, pay $1 or $2 and then the $4 shipping. So I was picking up books for a while for, $2, $3, $4, $5, $6 as source material or reading material. I did that with second edition D&D. I actually got the green bound limited edition versions long time back. I've been watching these for a while. I have wanted to purchase them, but it just fiscally just wasn't necessary or viable. But I got a gift card and I ordered the reprints out on Drive Through RPG of first edition D&D, the Player's Guide, the Dungeons Master's Guide, and the Monstrous Manual, and then the Arcana book. So I haven't received them yet. I will have by the time you listen to it, but I am very excited to read those because I'm still fascinated. Growing up, I played Redbox D&D for a little bit. And then another game called Starfire, and that'll be an interesting topic for another day. But I am fascinated by reading the first edition books. In fact, I was reading somewhere out on Reddit that they say the first edition DM guide is one of the most rich guides in terms of DM material. They said it was written, it is a unorganized mess, but it is still worth the read as a first edition dive from original D&D into what was then called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So, along with that, I have not also seen The Martian, just for the record. I know, I'm probably said this before, and I'll say it again. When Jason recommends a book to me, I trust that inherently. So I have The Martian and the other books in my queue for Amazon as I get a gift card or something like that. I'll pick one up because I'm more of a Kindle reader from a portability perspective. But first edition, second edition, and then the Star Trek stuff are really what's been on my plate. I'm in a career transition right now, and I have a little bit of extra time for a short period of time. By the time you hear this, that will have already ended. But I have a little bit of extra free time at the moment, so I'm taking advantage of it and doing a lot of reading. So that being said, I'll let you, Jason. I'll let you make any commentary, and then I'll let you wrap it up for this week.
Yeah, you read my mind. These few hundred miles away, we are from one another. As we wrap up, kind of going back to something you just said, Brad, about a comment we received. Shout out to Rob. Thank you very much for your feedback in Facebook. Your comments, which were awfully thoughtful, really perfectly encapsulated what Brad and I want to create and offer others with this podcast. So thank you, Professor. We owe you one for that. With that, thank you, listeners, as always, for sticking with us. You know the deal. You can find us in the show notes on Facebook. You can find us online. You can do all kinds of things, DysonMind.com. Be well, stay safe, have a good interim period until we see you and you hear us again.